Hello, Alexandra here. Today I am going to talk about the commonalities between green and turquoise, and I am so excited to do a series of videos on this. Before I talk about the commonalities, I do need to share a difference because they're not the same. So I'm going to share the difference, and then at the end I'll swing back around and talk about the commonalities of both being communal stages. So I've done a whole series on green, and it talks a lot about the shadow of green and tips and tricks and pitfalls. And one of the things I do say in those videos are that sometimes yellow is a little bit invisible to green, especially if they haven't studied spiral dynamics or integral, and that sometimes, on occasion, there are many integral groups, but there have been a couple of times where I was in an integral group with mostly green folks, and what happened is the green folks on that day really, it seemed like they hadn't really gone deeply into the stages, and the couple of people who were at yellow that I know of wanted to talk about the stages, and the stage green didn't, and I was told that the stages are hierarchical and they're of the patriarchy, and that teal is an insensitive stage, and that is a common misconception. The stages are about holarchies and increasing wholeness, and in Nomali Pereira's video on green and Leo at actualize.org's video on what the stages think of each other, both of them say that green sometimes has a misconception of what teal is. So by not studying the stages, we can miss a lot of context. And sometimes what I see is that green throws away the map or the map of the stages prematurely. What happens at some of the later stages, like getting to early and mid turquoise, is they've transcended and included the map of the stages. It's both and. So turquoise might be like, not so interested in the map, but they've got, if they've been through yellow, and a lot of yellows are really interested in the stages, like obsessively so in a good way, they still have a big framework that is, in the back of their awareness, where they have a lot of insight and context about the stages and can adapt their language and their messaging to people they are talking to. So this whole preamble is because a big shift happened. I was doing all these green videos and talking about the shadow of green, and I never mentioned it in an integral group because I thought, I'll just go with the flow. I'm not here to me. But today I attended an integral group that talked about the shadow of green, and we were in a safe spot, and I brought up that there are some integral communities I think that would really benefit from having material and facilitators that talk about exploring teal. And I did talk about the little bit of the invisibility factor, because sometimes during these times when green didn't want to talk about the stages and being a little bit invisible around green, sometimes it takes for me too long to explain the context around a point I'm making, and the point gets a little bit missed. I want to talk about how this difference between green and yellow or late yellow or early turquoise continued to happen in this group. So I said that, and we moved on to the shadow of mean green because we were talking about shadow of green. And so we started talking about political messaging and how greens can be rigid and harsh when they're in their outrage mode in politics, because they're so sensitive and they want to protect and help marginalized groups, that sometimes they're not aware that their messaging can actually push, we'll call it the other side politically, because right now we're very divided politically, can push them even further away. And I happen to watch a political podcast. It's a right of center, conservative, never Trumper podcast. And by the way, I really have to say, whatever your political views are, including if somehow a MAGA is for some reason listening to this, I respect you. I don't resent you. I have MAGAs in my family, and if I doubt my family will ever hear this, but if you know, I have love. I have a lot of love for people. They're well-intended. I'm well-intended. I don't have the scolding, and I'm not so much triggered by Amber. So I just repeated this fantastic point that Tim Miller on the Bulwark made, because Tim Miller is very good at messaging, and he used to be what I think he calls himself a former, quote, knife fighter for the Republican Party. He's very good at messaging, and he mentions that the Democrats are very weak at messaging and they don't, quote unquote, fight back. But he talked about the skill level and how messaging could work for Democrats. And here's what he said. And I repeated this kind of as a joke because it was a quick 1, 2, 3. Number 1, don't scold. Number 2, 2 to 3 word phrases. Number 3, commonalities such as populism. And everybody kind of laughed because it was, if you look at the context around the shadow of Amber, I think that people were laughing are really familiar with the context of the shadow of blue or amber and integral. Don't scold, because we don't want to throw fire on the polarities, because the shadow of blue, I'll call it blue in spiral dynamics, is wired in to us and them thinking. So that is referring to the shadow of blue. And 2 to 3 word phrases, anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism, and sometimes even black and white thinking and wanting a strong man or a strong person with blunt messaging is wired in to Amber or the shadow of Amber, depending on, if it's the anti-intellectualism, I'd say that's more of a shadow, but the quick black and white, blunt, strong man, strong person messaging is just more amberish. And the commonalities, such as populism, is turning around the inherent, quote unquote, us and them trait of the shadow of blue. So the shadow of blue, and maybe even just blue, they like to take care of their own community. And so with messaging, populism turns that us and them around, such as a message such as fight the oligarchy with Sanders and AOC, where you had MAGAs attending their event. We're now turning around the us and them towards the oligarchy. And, Reagan did this with the evil empire, Russia, and I don't remember who did Axis of Evil. That might have been George Bush, the Axis of Evil. So it was us against the Russians, us against the Axis of Evil. So we're not necessarily going to get rid of the us and them thinking. And inherent in this bullet-pointed formula for messaging, don't scold, 2 to 3 word phrases, commonalities such as populism, is the inherent understanding that stage green has more insight. It's a more whole stage. So stage green will be the ones who can transcend their shadow of scolding and more skillfully message. Amber is less likely to come out of their shadow. So stage green and the later stages have to reach back and do the work for messaging. And all of this context, I assume that everyone was aware of because we were in an integral group. But I sort of got greened a little bit. I didn't explain all this context. I realized my context was missed. And once again, I had assumed there were a lot of green people also in this group, that my context would be understood by everybody. But so again, and I will put this on myself. I didn't explain the context, but because this was something, people that were very, very familiar with the stages, again, yellow loves the stages, would have understood this context, whereas sometimes green is sort of familiar with the stages, but hasn't got to yellow, or they're obsessed with the stages, again, in a good way, and might miss some context. Sometimes green kind of lightly, seems like doesn't go very deeply into the stages, and I've noticed that greens sometimes prematurely do throw away the stages just to be present. So if we throw away all this wonderful deep material about the stages too prematurely, we're going to miss some context. And I do have to take radical self-responsibility that my context was quote unquote invisible. That's on me. I will get better at bullet pointing. And also, I wanted to mention this. Going into early turquoise, I also am starting just to care less. It's so much, at late yellow, I was just going through this phase of, oh man, I feel kind of invisible around greens. I'm not seen. And at early turquoise, I'm just starting to feel happy and love and hanging out with people. So part of sometimes now in integral groups, I'm just sitting there and I'm not commenting. I'm just being present. As you can see, I'm just having a lot of fun, and I just feel a lot of love. And so we'll see what happens. Again, letting things emerge. But I do have 2 political messaging videos. Let's see. I think I've got one on messaging to early stage orange in my yellow moving to turquoise series. I did have drinks with Doug Stanhope, who is one of Joe Rogan's closest friends, and I have an insight on why Joe Rogan thinks like he does and how that's related to early stage orange or umber and integral, or on Susanne-Cook Greuter's 9 levels of increasing embrace PDF, how that's related to the stage she calls the expert. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about this political messaging in a stage related basis, and I can't remember where messaging to blue is. It's either in my green series or my yellow series, and I have talked about that. So I just think sometimes stage green, if they don't, stage green, if they know you're at yellow, but they haven't studied the stages, they don't know that there might be a lot of context behind what you're saying, and they might ask more questions or clarification. Again, there was a time constraint, but I do want to talk about the bulwark. The bulwark sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes does have great tips on messaging. I've seen Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, who's a Democrat, on the bulwark, who's fantastic at messaging. And they interviewed Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, who's a Democrat, and he's fantastic at messaging. So we can pick up some of the messaging, especially Tim Miller he was an expert in messaging, and he's one of the main podcasters on the bulwark. He did work for the Republican Party, but he worked for campaigns. So sometimes you'll hear, he'll say, Democrats, here's what you need to do. Sarah Longwell on the bulwark has focus groups. She has focus groups for right-wing voters. And so they do understand messaging, sometimes I think a little better than the Democrats do right now. By the way, the funny thing is, it's a right of center podcast, but mostly Democrats watch it, and it's a lot of fun. So I thought I'd throw that out there if you're interested. But yeah, and if you listen to my messaging to early orange, Joe Rogan and comedy, and if you look at Tim Miller talking about punching back, you could have somebody, it'd have to be the right Democrat, and they'd have to have a good personality and be funny, that could go on Joe Rogan. Some of Joe Rogan's listeners are, maybe some amber, maybe some early orange. There is some us and them in the listenership they follow. The shadow of amber tends to follow a leader. That's why Joe Rogan has so much influence. But when we look at, sometimes Democrats obviously are at orange and at green, the progressives, so they're not as good at street fighting as some of the right wingers. So someone could go on the Joe Rogan show and talk about, quote, tax cuts for spoiled oligarchs. The right person could do this and it would be really funny for that show. But there's so much more fun and strength and strategy that the Democrats could be doing with messaging that they're just not doing. But once we look at the shadow of Amber, Amber loves a strong person. They love a joke. They love a not politically correct joke. It's talking about tax cuts for spoiled oligarchs flips around the us and them, and it taps into the anti-woke, not political correctness that a lot of the Ambers like and find funny, especially on, if you've seen Joe Rogan's comedy. That is sort of the place where a phrase like that might work. And I'm not saying that would work, but that's just an example of how quickly we can come up with little quick messages based on what works for Amber, knowing the shadow of Amber, knowing their framework. People could sit down and come up with, very quickly 30, 40, 50 messaging strategies they could try based on just the 3 bullet points I mentioned earlier. So, that is why understanding the stages is so useful. And I'm going to get around to the commonalities between turquoise and green, and that is the incredible communal nature and the willingness to offer presence, and both stages being relational. When we start to go into turquoise, we really crave a community. We really crave fellowship. We really crave, we're not so much in the individualistic nature of yellow, because I could tell you, when I was at mid-yellow, I couldn't care less if anyone saw me or didn't see me. I was doing my own thing. And what I realized is that at turquoise, it's less and less important whether we're seen. And of course, we can always provide context if we're verbally dexterous and skilled at that. But more importantly, it's the beingness. It's the being with people. It's just the presence. And whereas green is 2 stages later than blue, or amber and integral, and so green has more insight, is more whole, and therefore needs to take more responsibility, because amber is less likely to change. Radical responsibility, radical self-responsibility. It just occurred to me today, turquoise is 2 stages later than green. So hello turquoise, if I or you or anyone feels invisible, guess whose problem that is? And guess who needs to work on their parts or work on their shadow? It's not green. So this idea of, I'm just feeling love and communion and offering presence, because the communal stages, especially green and turquoise, love, they just love to give you presence. There really are a lot of similarities, and I'm going to talk about in my next video the similarities with purple for green and turquoise, and that is going to be an incredibly fun video because I have a lot of purple in me, especially at green. I was so purple. You'll see it is going to be fun, energy work, new agey stuff, uncommon holistic topics. Greens and turquoise can rock those out. Not everybody, but a lot of folks. And I will finally find that quote from the Spiral Dynamics and read it in my next video about the similarities of greens, turquoise, and purple. So sending you love, and see you in the next video.